people don't enjoy what they're doing, they simply won't do it. It actually needs to make you feel good.
Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Michaela Pascoe, a Senior Research Fellow of Health and Sport at Victoria University in Australia. She studies the health benefits of emerging mindfulness practices like meditation and yoga. Today, we specifically talk about how she analyzes different types of meditation and their impact on mental health symptoms. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I am very excited to learn about this area of research, as it definitely is something that has impacted my life. But before all that, I'd just love to hear a bit of an introduction as to what makes you interested in mindfulness.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My name is Michaela Pascoe. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Health and Sport at Victoria University in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. And my interest in meditation has come from a personal one. I started practicing meditation when I was about 21. And like a lot of people do at that age, I was struggling with some mental wellness. So I was experiencing things like some symptoms of anxiety, and my well-being wasn't very great at that time. And we know that that's a really high risk period for people between sort of 15 and 25 in terms of mental health. And I started practicing meditation. I think a lot of people may have found that now with COVID and everything, that they've thought, oh, well, what can I do to try and facilitate my well-being? And I found it to be really beneficial. And I was surprised at how beneficial it was, actually. I thought, wow, this has just had such a huge impact in terms of how I relate to the world and myself in particular and other people around me. And I wondered why I wasn't taught it as part of my education. And I understand now that people are. I see that my niece does some breathing exercises and meditations and stuff in her prep class. But I was also quite interested in understanding how and why it was able to improve my well-being so dramatically. And my area is neuroscience, psychology. So I really wanted to start researching that as part of my work. And I've been doing that for some years now. Particularly, I was interested in how meditation could impact stress and our experiences of stress and how we deal with the daily stresses that we encounter. And, these can be sometimes just small things like day-to-day stuff, or it can be something really big and uncertain, like the sort of undertone of what's going on in the world right now. And recently I've been looking at how lifestyle, including mindfulness practices, can be used to sort of promote or protect well-being for people during lockdowns. In Melbourne, we've been in lockdown for a very long time, over 200 days maybe, and it's been very hard for people. It's been very hard for students, and I work at a university, and the students have been studying from home and not being able to access campus. There's been some people who have been enrolled in their courses, and a year and a half into their degree, they've hardly spent any time on campus. So student services have funded some work to try and promote the well-being of students. And as part of that, we developed an online yoga program. It was a 10-week course, and we made it available to students so that they could partake in this course and practice some mindfulness and some yoga and some meditation, some breathing exercise. And we found that it, not surprisingly, was able to sort of improve the well-being of this small cohort of students. I'll say it was a small study because it was a pilot, but that's what we've been looking at lately, as well as some other lifestyle interventions and health promotion strategies, but they haven't been based around meditation, although meditation has been part of them. There's also been aspects of physical activity and getting enough sleep and healthy eating and maintaining social relationships and et cetera, et cetera. So all of the sort of wider aspects of lifestyle, health and well-being.
Yeah, there is a lot of cool work going on right now. And it's really amazing to hear how you took that personal experience and used it to spark an entire career. I'm sure that a lot of people are being benefited directly from your work now. So it's really amazing to hear how you're making an impact there. I guess to start off with, it would be great to focus on, there are a bunch of different types of meditation, pick whichever one you want to explain. But Could you talk about some of the science behind just the basics of what meditation is doing to our brain and why it works?
That's a really good point. There are a lot of different types of meditations, and there's actually a little bit of discussion in the literature regarding how to define different types of meditation, because some people think it's best to define meditations based on their philosophical underpinnings, and other people have looked at how they impact brainwave activity or how they impact different areas of activation or deactivation in the brain. So there's not really a very clear definition about how to categorize meditations, but generally when we're talking about meditations, you can consider it to be on a spectrum rather than think about categories. Some meditations are what we call attention focused. The aim is to always bring your attention back to a particular object. And as your attention wanders, you bring it back, and again and again and again. And it will wander again and again and again. A really important part of the sort of underpinnings of these meditation practices is, as your attention wanders, not to beat yourself up or become very critical, but instead just to sort of accept the experience as it is, be kind to yourself, but redirect your attention back to this point of focus. That could be the breath, or it could be a visual image. It could be a mantra. On the other side of the spectrum, we have what's often called mindfulness meditation. And that is more about sort of observing things as they occur and doing that from a position, again, of non-judgment and acceptance, but sort of paying attention to your thoughts as they rise, being present with them, letting them move on. So you're not continually bringing your attention back to a particular thing, one certain thing. You're instead noticing the various thoughts, feelings, emotions that pop up, but trying not to get lost in them, trying not to get carried away in the story of them, and instead being the observer. Most meditations do exist on this, somewhere on the spectrum, but they also will move as well. Some move throughout maybe a single meditation practice, or maybe over a period of a week or a few months. If we're talking about what meditations do in terms of the brain, there's a little bit of difference depending on if we're talking about focused attention or mindfulness meditations. And of course, there's other forms as well, but I'll probably just stick to those today. And there are some similarities and there are some differences. So we see that all forms of meditation seem to increase what's called interoception, which is our ability to pay attention to our internal bodily states. So these are things like, our breath and our heartbeat or whatever it is that's going on. And that makes sense because a lot of meditation is really tied to bringing ourselves back to this internal state. So that's pretty consistent. Whereas we see that focused attention meditations can be really good at training our attention and our concentration, which of course is not surprising. So it's like going to the gym, you go and you pick up weights and you get stronger over time. And in terms of changes in mental health outcomes, there doesn't seem to be a lot of research to say that one type of meditation is more beneficial than another. And this probably relates to some of the other underlying mechanisms, because forms of meditation tend to train things like self-compassion, which is this ability to be kind to ourselves. It's like treating yourself like a friend rather than an enemy. They'd all train mindfulness, which is our ability to be present in the moment rather than living in the past or the future. They all train this sense of acceptance. So rather than trying to fight what is, being able to be present and sit with what is. These psychological processes are really closely tied to better mental health and well-being. So we see that people who have higher levels of self-compassion are less likely to develop, say, post-traumatic stress disorder. If veterans, for example, once they return from combat, are less likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder if they have higher levels of self-compassion. Or people with higher levels of mindfulness are more likely to have better mental health, less likely to have depression-related symptoms. But ultimately, I would say it doesn't really matter what type of meditation you choose to do. What's really important is to think about what you actually enjoy and to do that. Because if you don't like something, you won't do it. And if you don't do it, you can't get the benefits. So acknowledging the importance of actually enjoying the process is really important. It should be something that's not awful, that you think, I don't want to do that. But if you feel like you can actually engage, then you're more likely to keep going back and back again.
Yeah. The first question people ask is, what does this do? And the second is, how do I do it consistently? So we will definitely get to that question. I did have a few follow-ups based on the psychological effects you were telling me about. How do you measure each of these things? So I noted you said introspection, focus, self-compassion, acceptance, and mindfulness.
Yep. They're most commonly measured by things called self-report scales, which are these measures that have been tested and validated, and they have a series of questions. So if you're looking at something like mindfulness, the questions might be, how frequently might I eat something and not really pay attention to that? Sometimes we eat on the run, or whatever it is, and we just sort of go, oh, I just ate that food and where did it go? And through this series of asking a lot of these questions, you can sort of gain a sense of someone's levels of how present they are in their daily lives, whether that's higher or lower. And it's the same for self-compassion. So there could be questions like, when something goes wrong in my life, do I criticize myself? Through these self-reported measures, you can sort of gain a little bit of an idea. There are some limitations with self-reported measures. Sometimes people can respond in a way that they think you might want them to respond rather than responding honestly. But there's also some ways around that as well. So having a few different questions that might be worded differently, but they might measure the same thing. But generally, these tools are quite commonly used in psychological research as a way to understand somebody's experiences. They're also used as a way to gauge levels of symptoms of things like depression or anxiety. And then you can compare that, I guess, with different programs of meditation and to look at sort of changes that might occur over time if somebody were to engage in a meditation practice compared to engaging in a different type of practice. But you can look at the changes if levels go up or down over a period of time.
And then regarding what you said about measuring activity in the brain, how do we do that?
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot of different methods, but a very common one is something called fMRI, functional MRI. And basically what that does is it looks at how much oxygen or blood is going to a certain region of the brain when somebody engages in a certain activity. So what this is essentially somebody's lying in a machine and they might be looking at photographs of something or images of something, and certain parts of the brain will light up. Or they might be doing a test. One of these tests, for example, is where they might read a word. The word might be yellow, but the word is written in red. And it confuses you because you read the word yellow in red. And so then you have to make a decision. You have to click if the word is saying yellow or red. And then you see what happens in the brain. You can essentially see what areas of the brain are receiving glucose, oxygen, blood. And people can meditate in these machines.
Yeah, those people must be expert meditators. I don't think I could do that.
They're very loud machines. So yeah, you'd have to be quite focused because they're not quiet.
Well, yeah. And then let's turn to the other thing that we brought up. So what is your experience been like with the common challenges people have during meditation?
Yeah, I think finding something you like is really important. And this is really clear in other areas of research, like physical activity. If people don't enjoy what they're doing, they simply won't do it. It actually needs to make you feel good. So I would say try different things until you find something that really works for you. Not everything will work for everyone. And as we were saying before, there's so many different types of meditation. And meditation doesn't necessarily have to be just sitting in one spot and trying to focus our attention. We can have moving-based meditations like yoga, or even just trying to be more mindful in our daily lives. Like we used the example before of eating food. Mindful eating is an activity that's often used as well in clinical settings, but actually just paying attention to the experience of eating our food, which often we don't. So finding something you like is really important. It can also be very helpful to try and build a routine. So maybe if there's a certain time of the day, and in those practices, starting small, you might want to start for 1 minute. If you try to sit down and meditate for half an hour, the first attempt, it can be very hard because it's almost like we were saying about going to the gym before. You won't go into the gym and pick up 200 kilos and bench press it. You'll start small and you'll build up. And also it could be very helpful to bring in an element of a social element. So maybe you might go to a meditation class or do something with a friend or somebody else that you might live with. You can maybe create a space and an environment where it becomes a little bit easier to do that because somebody else is there kind of going, come on, we're going to do this thing now.
Yeah, no, in my experience, it's not even like a minute. I came across this
Mm.
very helpful goal setting technique recently, which was you have to take one mindful breath per day. You can like always find time for one breath. There's no
Yeah.
excuses, but if I sit down to do one breath, then I'll probably do more than one. So I see what you're
Mm.
saying about start small and then it builds up.
Yeah, I like that. One mindful breath a day. Yeah, it's achievable.
Yeah. And I do hope that more and more people start to meditate. I'd love to turn the discussion a bit. Could you tell me a bit about the history of how meditation started being transferred to more mainstream life?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of interest in various mind altering approaches, and meditation was among those. There was a particular person called John Kabat-Zinn, and he ended up creating something called mindfulness-based stress reduction, which was originally used to help people with managing pain. And that has since grown, and other types of mindfulness-based therapies have developed. And also mindfulness-based stress reduction has been used in different populations to help different sorts of psychological outcomes. There was also some interest in transcendental meditation, which just is another form of meditation, in about the 60s as well in the United States. And it sort of moved out from there. But certainly John Kabat-Zinn has been a big pioneer in terms of bringing it to the West. And from that, we've had the development of things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. Yeah, and I could go on for a while, but they're just names of different mindfulness-based therapies, essentially. But they've been adapted to a whole lot of different psychological states and profiles. But ultimately, it started with an individual saying, well, I think that this could be really helpful for people who have chronic pain. But of course, as you're saying, like, meditation practices have existed in the East for thousands of years. So it's not new. It's just that it's become newly popular. And particularly in the last few decades, there's been a real surge in interest. And particularly in the last sort of 20 years, there's been this extraordinary increase in research that's been looking at the efficacy of mindfulness-based therapies.
Yeah, I'm very excited to see this research. Personally, in my journey, it's always been like the oral tradition being passed down. Have you had any particular experiences like interacting with Indigenous communities, Indigenous knowledge centers to see where science and like these two things can interact together?
Oh, there's definitely a lot more. We could be doing a lot more, I think. And this is a really good point. Just because something has been researched, it does not mean that something that hasn't been researched is not effective. And so often we see that, people talk about something being scientifically validated and therefore we know it's great. And then they dismiss things that haven't been scientifically validated. But just because something hasn't had the evidence behind it, that just could be because it hasn't actually gone through that process. And there's a few reasons for that. Often, actually, it's about funding, because if somebody's going to put money in something, there needs to be some sort of reason behind that. And usually that can be financially driven. And also it's about accessing information and being able to form some sort of relationship that's meaningful for different people and beneficial for different people. I haven't had, I guess, so much opportunity, particularly in Australia. We have, Indigenous populations have so much to offer. And generally in Australia, there's a huge lack of uptake or knowledge around that, because there's lots of pre-existing problems in Australia in terms of lack of equality that still exists and is really strong. That's made it very problematic in terms of being able to really acknowledge, embrace, share, and disseminate some really valuable and powerful knowledge, essentially. But we may, hopefully see some of those wounds start to heal a little bit in the future if our governments and countries can move towards that in a better way. But we do see, I guess, from some other cultures that there's been, and this hasn't been my research, but I know that there's been more research looking at the efficacy of things like acupuncture, which is obviously, Chinese medicine or acupressure, or even things like Chinese medicinal herbs. And the research for that, again, it's pretty new. It's only been happening in sort of the last few decades. And again, they've seen really promising results. So I think that there's definitely space to explore more alternative or complementary forms of medicine. It's happening already, but it's generally happening bit slower than some other areas. And a lot of that does have to do with financial investment and being able to have the ability to actually create and conduct those studies.
Yeah, it's great to hear about these issues because future psychologists will be working on exactly these problems. And to wrap up with, which resources would you recommend for people to learn more about meditation?
Yeah, well, I think you hit it before when you said you downloaded an app.
There are lots of free meditation apps like Headspace, Calm, and Insight Timer.
There's also YouTube videos, guided meditations, and of course there's classes, but maybe an app is probably a really good spot to just start and have a go just for a minute or two.
Yeah, that's a great actionable to wrap up with. As we said, one mindful breath, people can do it. So I really appreciated this podcast and getting to touch on so many different topics. I am very excited for the future of this discipline. So thank you for taking that initial exposure and then just continuing to build your career on top of that.